Hi, humans. I put a post a couple of days ago on my blog called Spiritual Teachers Stop Enabling Addicts. And the comments section under it on my Facebook page went crazy. And it's still going on and on and on with all sorts of people accusing me of all sorts of things. I'm a racist. I'm close-minded. People are implying that it's exactly the same thing as abstinence-only education and getting real personal. Somebody said Japanese Buddhist masters send all their worst students to the United States, implying that's what happened to me. All kinds of nasty stuff, which kind of confirms what I said at the beginning, which is that if you criticize drug use, people take it personally and take it as a personal attack. What I was trying to say is that if you're a spiritual teacher, there are people out there who take you very seriously. And in my years of doing this job, I've noticed this. And I've thought, I got to be careful what I say, because I don't know where it's going to go with certain people. So I think that in my capacity as a spiritual teacher, as a Zen teacher, I need to take a very hard line against drug use as spirituality. And you can read the article if you want, I'll link to it. I thought I would talk to you here about my experience of using drugs as spiritual practice. Not just using drugs in general, although we'll touch on that, but using drugs as spiritual practice. Now, when I was a little kid, I don't know how old, just getting old enough to think, I noticed that this world I was living in, this life I was living, was very mysterious. Like, why am I here? What am I? Who am I? What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to do anything? Does it matter? These questions weighed heavy on my little 8-year-old brain, or however old I was when I started thinking these things. And by the time I reached adolescence, it had become almost a crisis of wanting to figure this shit out. When I was, 12 or 13, maybe younger, I started getting into the Beatles. The pop music at the time was all arena rock and disco. And I dug back into the past because I didn't think the present musical scene was very interesting. And so the Beatles were a big deal for me. And read everything I could, and that's where I learned that the Beatles were also interested in understanding the nature of existence. That's what attracted me to them, not just their music, but this philosophical stance that they had. And, of course, I became aware that one of the ways in which the Beatles had attempted to research what life is was using drugs. They used particularly marijuana and LSD. So I was kind of like, well, I want to try some marijuana and some LSD and see if that helps in my quest. I had a friend named Joe who had a friend named Pete, and Joe introduced me to Pete, and Pete became my friend, and Pete knew where to get pot. I must have been about 15 and figured I was old enough to handle it. So Pete got me and Joe high for the first time, and I had a good time. It was kind of fun to be stoned. So it became a kind of a habit for me. Mostly I would do it with Joe. We would go to this clubhouse that he had in the backyard of his house, and we would smoke pot. And then we'd walk up to the McDonald's, which was like 2 miles away. Or we'd walk to the high school football stadium, which was about half a mile away. And we'd go to the games, but we wouldn't watch the games. We'd just be high, walking around and around. And although I was enjoying getting high, I wasn't really discovering anything profound about myself. It seemed to be a side track. And at one point, Joe got a hold of some weed that we smoked with the intention of smoking up and then doing our usual walk to McDonald's. But this weed hit us hard. And what I remember mostly was laying on the floor of Joe's little clubhouse, holding on as if it was a ship rocking. That was kind of scary. Joe was in the same state. The next morning, I remember we got out the bag of weed. So we looked at this weed under the light and saw that there was all these specks of white stuff in it. Now, there was a rumor going around that people were spiking pot with PCP, and I have my suspicions that we must have got a hold of some of that stuff, because that was like no marijuana I've ever had before or since. Now, I don't know if that was the last time I smoked pot in those days, but I remember giving up on it around that time. And by the time I was 16, I was done, because I was bored with it. Not because I had any idea that it was immoral to do it or anything like that, just because I found marijuana kind of boring. Fast forward a little bit. The year I got out of high school, I joined Zero Defects. And this got me into the punk scene. And the punk scene was mostly people older than me and more experienced. And I became aware that a lot of them had done LSD. Particularly Jimmy Image, the singer of Zero Defects, would sometimes talk about it. So I remember asking him, is it true that you can see God when you're on LSD? And he said, yeah, that's true, but you can also see the devil too. In spite of that, I asked Jimmy if he knew where we could get some acid, and he did. So we went to a place in the back of a pickup truck, some hippie house. In the freezer was blotter, acid blotter. And he cut us off some blotter acid, and I paid him $3 for my hit. I think it was $3. I thought, well, cheap. Jimmy didn't join that trip. I'm not sure who I tripped with that time, but I took it, and I'm waiting for this experience of seeing God, but it never happened. The trip was interesting, and I saw trails in front of my eyes when I'd wave my hand around, and colors got brighter and things were weird and whatever. Walked around the woods of Kent, Ohio. I remember doing that. But nothing mystical happened. No connection with God, and nothing like that. So, I don't know, a couple weeks, a month later, I tried it again. Same thing. Walked around the woods. It was fun. It was weird. Saw some trippy shit, but no mystical connection with the spiritual world or anything. Nothing. Third trip, I was up in Cleveland with, I think, some members of Starvation Army. We walked around Lakewood, Ohio all night. I remember a dog following us, this old kind of slow dog who wanted to hang out with us, and we let him follow us around. It was trippy. It was fun. No enlightenment. So I did it again. And that was really strong. My main memory of that trip was just sheer terror. And the terror was caused by the fact that I did not have any comprehension of time anymore. I couldn't wrap my head around the concept of time. I remember having a clear chain of thoughts. I took acid 2 hours ago. I am now peaking. The peak will last at the most another 2 hours, and then I'll start to be normal again, so all I have to do is wait it out. I had that clear thought in my head, but I couldn't make any sense out of that thought, because the concept of there being a time removed from this time made no sense at all. I couldn't get anything out of that. And so this increased my panic, because I knew I would be okay in 2 hours, but what in God's name was 2 hours? So I decided, well, this is silly. This is not what I'm looking for spiritually. And that's what was important to me. The reason why goes back to the thing I said at the very beginning of this video. I wanted to know what this world was, what this mind and this body were. I wanted to understand them clearly. And all the LSD did was confuse my senses, so that I got this kind of sensory derangement happening. And it's fun because it's novel and weird, but it didn't answer anything. I just decided no more drugs. I didn't decide this because I thought it was the moral thing to do or because I read the Buddhist precepts or any of that. I just decided this is a road that leads nowhere, or at least it doesn't lead anywhere I want to go. I probably smoked pot now and then after that, but no more acid and no more of trying to find anything spiritual through drugs. Now, fast forward some more. I'm living in Japan, and it's years later, and I've gotten very intense in my Zen practice. It became the main thing I was doing with my life. I worked at Tsuburaya Productions. I had a job. I had a life. But my main focus at the time was Zen practice. As I got deeper and deeper into the Zen practice, I started to notice a couple of interesting things that at first kind of weirded me out. Number one, when you do acid, one of the first things you notice is all of a sudden the world goes from sepia tone to technicolor. Like you thought you were seeing colors before you did the acid, but then when you do it, you're like, whoa, there's a hell of a lot more colors than I thought. And what I started to notice was, as I'm walking around Tokyo completely straight, everything starts to look like that. Like super colorful and super bright. And I started to get a different sense of time where I could understand what people meant when they said 2 hours from now. I could hold that concept in my head. But I also could hold in my head this idea or this way of looking at things that I'd first experienced on LSD of being completely timeless. That there could be no other time than this, and that anything else was just some kind of invention I made up in my head, or that we all agreed on. So I talked to Nishijima Roshi about that, and he said, oh yeah, that happens, no worries. And I said, well, what it's like being on LSD? And he's like, well, I've never tried LSD, but it doesn't matter if it's similar. So I'm like, okay. Even though while on LSD, I started to see colors more clearly and had what arguably might be a sense of the real nature of time. And maybe I had a couple other sort of interesting revelations here and there. I don't really remember. None of them did me much good because they were not integrated into anything. They were just kind of randomly blopped there. And because I had had these experiences under the influence of drugs, I couldn't be sure if they were anything other than just the effects of being high. The reason I stopped using them as a spiritual practice is because I'm interested in this world, this life, this mind, this body. And all the drugs did was alter that and make everything less clear than it had been before. I kind of feel like we are put on this earth. We are manifestations of the universe. And the universe wants something, for lack of a better way to put it. And what it wants is to see through this lens. And my main duty is to try to keep that as clear as possible so that whatever is behind this can see through it. The drugs never touched the core of who I was. They just kind of made a different lens through which to see that was a distorted sort of funhouse mirror lens that wasn't useful. So I just gave up on the whole thing. There are people out there who complain that I didn't use enough drugs. Like if I'd tripped a few more times, or if I'd gotten a hold of better acid or something like that, then I would understand, or then I would be... No, that's because the problem is at the very core of the whole thing for me. The core problem is altering your mind and body. And that doesn't seem to me to be useful at all for understanding the mind and body. I just thought it's a dead end to spiritual practice. Now, I don't care if you want to get high. It doesn't mean shit to me. In fact, last November in the state of California, we got to vote on whether to make marijuana legal statewide, and I voted yes, make marijuana legal, because I think it should be legal. Furthermore, doesn't mean you have to be straight edge to be a good Buddhist. I think if you want to have the complete experience of Buddhist practice, the best way is to just don't do any drugs. But, you know, that your life is your own. You do what you want. I'm just against the idea of endorsing drugs as a spiritual practice. So that's my take on things. Take it if you want, leave it if you want, watch it while you're high if you want. It might be funny that way. I don't care. If you like what you heard or you thought it was interesting, feel free to make a donation. There's information below about Patreon and how to do it through PayPal and whatever. That's how I make my living. Thank you very much, and talk to you later.